Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Meetup this evening, and I think there's been great talks coming up. My name is Ben Bray. I'm here with my colleague Fiona. We work for a company called IQVIA. We'll tell you a little bit more about what we do as a company and our day job a bit later on. My job at IQVIA is I'm medical director for data science and director of epidemiology. So I'm a medical doctor by background and a data scientist. Fiona, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, my name is Fiona Grimson. I'm a data scientist at IQVIA as well. I work with Ben. I'm a statistician by background. I've been working at IQVIA about 2 years on healthcare data.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks, Fiona. So we're gonna spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about a specific issue related to machine learning and predictive analytics in healthcare. And this is about how you can assess generalizability of the models you're building, which is a challenge across kind of all settings for predictive analytics, but there's specific considerations in healthcare. Can I just, a brief raise of hands, does anyone actually work in a healthcare setting or do some healthcare data? Okay, fantastic, good numbers. And anyone heard of IQVIA? Okay, good numbers as well, fantastic. But sometimes not so many. So IQVIA is a global company whose mission is to improve human health through data. So we are the world's largest healthcare data science company. The reason why I asked if people heard about IQVIA is our customers are largely other companies, particularly organizations such as the life science industry who might be developing new drugs or treatments, healthcare providers like the NHS, regulators in healthcare such as the FDA or the EMA. So that's who we work for. And we bring our skills and data to the sort of data science challenges that they have, that particularly focused on demonstrating the sort of safety and effectiveness of new medicines and new medical treatments as people are developing these and bringing them into healthcare. So what we bring along to it, we bring along a lot of expertise. So we employ thousands of scientists and medical doctors and people with skills. We have lots of data and partner with other organizations using healthcare data. We develop technologies. We've got a big technology solutions team and develop software and produce a lot of advanced analytics for various users in healthcare. That might be sort of research outputs for people who want clinical trials or data science outputs, or sort of real-time analytics if you're running a hospital or running a healthcare company. And we've got a big presence in the UK. So we have about 4,000 people in the UK and a big office up at King's Cross where Fiona and I work. And we do different things, but the bit of IQVIA we work for is this thing in green, which is called Real-World Insights. So almost 300 data scientists in the UK and have data on anonymized healthcare data on lots of patients. So one data set might have 17 million patients from the UK, collecting anonymized healthcare data, helping to produce research evidence for the different types of users. So healthcare data is our bread and butter, and we have an increasing number of people come to us saying, can you help us understand and develop our predictive analytics or our machine learning models and help us to work out are these safe and appropriate for use in healthcare settings? Fiona.
Okay, so real-world data, as we call it, what we mean by that is data that's collected on patients as part of their routine clinical care. So outside of the setting of clinical trials, through a patient's normal journey through the healthcare system. And on this slide, there's a number of examples of the places where we might be collecting data from. And you can think of your experience as a patient as well. When you next visit your GP, I think half the time you see they spend typing notes into their computer, and this is where it's going. So you can see for a patient, they might be data from pharmacies, electronic medical records, social media even, from physicians. They have prescriptions, survey panels, institutions like hospitals collect data as well on how the resources are being used in the hospital, and countries even. For instance, we'll collect disease registries on every patient who has, for instance, cancer in that country to see what is the national incidence, for instance, of cancer. So a lot of data is being collected on patients as part of their routine clinical practice. And this real-world data has been mentioned as increasingly being used to carry out medical research projects, which is what our work is all about. And that includes developing machine learning algorithms. So what we use real-world data for is to help our clients demonstrate how patients can be treated safely, effectively, and economically, depending on who that client might be. And so in our team that Ben and I work on, we have epidemiologists, statisticians, data scientists, and health economists as well. So the type of research questions that we might be trying to answer, some examples of them are up here. Oftentimes we'll want to know about the characteristics of the populations we're looking at. Who's being diagnosed, what do they look like, the characteristics of the disease itself, clinical practice, so what patients tend to be treated with, if one treatment fails, what happens next, the safety of the drug, so the occurrence of adverse events, for instance, outcomes like survival, and comparing this, for instance, to a clinical trial, costs for those people who are paying for the patient's healthcare, and scientific advancements. So, for instance, the presence of novel biomarkers and whether that's associated with a different kind of outcome. And we have a lot of different types of data that we might use to answer these questions, and the type of question informs the type of data that we might select. So the three most important ones I've pulled out here that we use the most often are administrative claims data, so that's data collected so that hospitals and healthcare providers can bill for treatments and for healthcare. Registries, so these are the databases set up often at a regional or national level to gather information about people with a specific disease or a specific treatment. And electronic health records, so this is just patients' health records that they accumulate, for instance, in hospital as they spend time there. So what we use, I would say more often than not, are electronic health records. That's because they contain the most detailed data, but there are also considerations for using this for research because this is data that's not primarily collected for research, so it can be challenging to use it. So for one reason, privacy and ethics. So I've talked a lot about collecting patient data. It's not like we can get any patient data we want. Hospitals and health records are amongst the most sensitive and personal types of data, and we're always bound to use these responsibly and respect the privacy of the patients. And that also involves getting ethical approval from the data owners for all of the studies that we do. Complexity. Medical records use a really wide variety of terminologies and formats, and in different countries there are different standards for terminologies, for instance. So the way that diseases are coded in electronic medical records can be very different and can be very complex. You also get complexity, for instance, in linking data together. So even within a database, data coming from different sources might have conflicting information in it. And if you want to link together data from different sources, sometimes it can be very challenging, for instance, to match patients from one to the other. Messiness as well. So this is data that's coming from real life, from hospitals and GPs. So missing data is very common, and it's very rarely missing at random, so that makes our modeling very challenging. It's common to see errors in the data, such as an incorrect diagnosis. And in many situations, for instance, if you would like to do some kind of supervised learning, we have no grounds for truth or labels for training our models. Access is another issue that has to do with the data privacy. So most health records will stay within a single hospital. They're very rarely shared outside. So there are only a small number of very large-scale data sets with anonymized health records available for research. and records for a single patient from different databases are very hard to combine. So last but not least, of course, data limitations. So recording the data is a burden for the doctor, for the GP. They're very busy, and so they tend to record, for instance, the data that's essential for them for reimbursement or for prescribing, and that's much better captured than other types of information, such as why they did one thing and not the other. But despite that, it's still a very rich source of data on patients.
Thank you. Yeah, so despite all those challenges, there's still loads of potential opportunity for using healthcare data responsibly in ways that are going to help improve patients and patient care. And particularly interested in this electronic medical record data because it's very rich, highly multidimensional, longitudinal. We're starting to, well, in some healthcare systems have basically got sort of cradle-to-grave healthcare records, so records across people's entire lives. And so it's a great foundation for sort of building some predictive analytics and research. And here's a recent example from colleagues at Google DeepMind who used hospital-based electronic healthcare records to predict patients' risk of getting a condition called acute kidney injury, so rapid deterioration of their kidney function. So this is the type of work that we might kind of get evaluated or get involved in, although we weren't involved in this specific study. So I want to move on to the sort of the technical meat of the talk today, which is about this issue of validation. And lots of this will be familiar to you anyway, but I want to emphasize in this particular issue, and this is around the importance of external validation or out-of-sample validation of your algorithms in a healthcare setting. So internal validation, as you'll know very well, assesses the accuracy of the predictions made by your model using data very similar to the training data. So it might even be split data that you've held back as part of a holdout set. And there's various different methods for internal validation, including bootstrapping, cross-validation, using a holdout set, or temporal validation, where you kind of cut the data over time. External validation measures the accuracy of your model, your trained model, against related but different data. So it's not the same as the data that was used to train the model. It's not even like a subsample or a cut of the original of the data used to train the model. It's something completely different, but is related in some important way. And I've said go out and find new data, but that's really the challenge. You can't use it using some variation of your existing data. You have to go out and find new data that's been generated in the real world under different conditions. And you'll see this concept of this related but different data is a bit fuzzy, and we'll go on and talk about what we mean by that in a more formal way and how you can evaluate it in a few slides on. So the key part of it is this internal validation assess different aspects of the accuracy of your predictions. So your internal validation formally assesses the reproducibility of your predictions. So what is the how accurate the predictions made by your trained model when given new instances or new samples of data very similar to your training data. Whereas the external validation assesses this concept called transportability. So how accurately do your predictions transport to a new setting or data generated under different conditions, and answer the questions as how well does your trained model generalize to different sources and settings. And you can only assess transportability by assessing your trained algorithm with data collected from different sources, which is why it's more challenging. One of the reasons why it's more challenging, it's often not done, and sometimes when you do it, the results can be quite disappointing because you think, oh, I had this fantastic model, and then it's not so fantastic when you test it against completely different settings or environments. So why is this important in healthcare? Well, people are trying to use machine learning to build scalable sort of analytics and solutions to try and solve various problems in healthcare, and want to do this in ways that can actually be scaled up and deployed in the real world in lots of different settings. So, a very typical example would be So I've, based in company based in California, organization based in California, they've built a algorithm that uses CT data to automatically diagnose lung cancer in patients. Can we use that same trained algorithm in a hospital in Beijing or London or Sydney? Will it be as accurate under the same conditions in which it's trained by? And this is the sort of concept of transportability. And the reason why it's important is that different sort of stakeholders in healthcare need your models not to be accurate just under the same conditions under which you built your model and trained it. It's also they want to demonstrate this issue of transportability. So, who are these type of people? So, healthcare regulators, for example. The examples might be the Federal Drugs Administration or the European Medicines Agency. Now, or certainly imminently, will be regulating machine learning models and algorithms in the same way that they do medical devices. So what we mean by a medical device is basically a physical thing used in a healthcare setting. An example might be like a pacemaker or a metal hip replacement. Now your algorithms you're developing are going to be assessed by the same regulators in the same way that they're thinking about pacemakers and CT machines and anything that goes in the body in part of a healthcare setting. So people need to demonstrate that the trained algorithms are safe, they make correct, and they work the way they are expected. And so this issue of, does your algorithm work in Beijing as it does in San Francisco, is a question that the regulators will be asking before you're allowed to use your algorithm as part of sort of routine patient care. So there's a big sort of regulatory barrier where we need to try and understand the performance of our trained models and demonstrate that they perform as performed. Who else is interested? Doctors want to know. So doctors I can tell you personally, are a little bit suspicious of things they don't understand, often not super complicated people, and might be a bit suspicious of a black box or getting a recommendation from an algorithm when we don't know where it comes from. So in order to get trust from doctors and other healthcare professionals for using your algorithms, they need to understand that the algorithm is going to perform well under their particular clinical settings. Are they going to perform well for their patients as they are for the setting or the setting which the model was originally trained in? And of course, patients are intimately concerned with the accuracy of these things. If I'm a patient and I'm having some clinical decision or treatment recommendation is being driven by an algorithm, then I'm 100% tell you I would like to know that it's accurate and performing well and performing as expected. So all these different stakeholders asking, even if they don't know the right technical words for it, are asking for the transportability of your model and its performance and predictions. So, as I touched on earlier on, the idea about transportability means testing your algorithm against related but different data. So what this means, basically, to how you go about doing this, basically is after your initial stage of training your algorithm, so you might do your first initial bit, so for example your cross-validation, then you might evaluate a typical workflow, you might evaluate against a holdout set. If your model starts to perform badly at that stage, you've really done a bad job, and it's probably like start again. It might be just a bad model or badly overfitted. If your data performs well in your holdout set with good accurate predictions, but then when faced with the first lot of new data falls down and starts to perform poorly, then again that might be a problem with overfitting. But as you test more and more against different sources of new data, the greater the performance against new data, completely new data it hasn't seen before, generated under different conditions and different settings, then the more and more confident you can be that you've built a model that's genuinely transportable. Okay? And that when it's presented with data the next time round, then it's going to make accurate predictions without having to do a formal evaluation or assessment of its performance. It's the models at the bottom which perform well consistently under lots and lots of different circumstances even in data that's quite different, you can be pretty confident you can scale it up and use it and be confident in its predictions. So I talked about this thing called this related but different data. It's, in all honesty, not a super well-defined concept, which makes it a little bit frustrating when you say, well, how different does my data have to be before I can start being confident in demonstrating this transportability of my data. So on a simple way, you can actually just observe the difference in your data. So imagine you've got one lot of data you've trained your model on. You go out, to different setting, different country, different source of data, and you can look at the data and just compare the parameters on a simple way and just say how different does it look. The challenge is that it's just simple, that kind of like face different doesn't always capture the important differences in the data. So there might be fundamental differences in the data or similarities in the data you can't really assess using simple analytical methods or visually because they're embedded in sort of multi-dimensional relationships between features in the data, and that's very hard to untangle just like at simple face value. We also know that one of the challenges that Fiona was talking about in terms of healthcare data is that it's messy, it's often collected in different ways in different settings. Different electronic healthcare systems collect different data in different formats. It's often, very challenging to try and find data that's similar enough, contains the same features such that you can reproduce the assessment of its transportability. And also things change over time. So like healthcare is actually changing. So like every month there's a new treatment, or like patients change. So trying to capture that is also a bit challenging. But despite this idea about related but different, it is woolly, it's a bit complicated, but there are things you can do that are a bit more sophisticated than just looking at the data and going out and finding stuff.
Sure. So we have a variety of methods available to us to assess internal validity of our model on the data we trained it on, which you're probably already familiar with. But there have also been methods proposed to assess transportability with this related but different type of data. And one of them, for instance, might be a membership model where, aside from the algorithm you've fitted, you could look at the data you have in your training set and your potential external data set and fit a model to try and distinguish which patient belongs to which. So if the patients are very similar, you won't be able to tell which data set they came from. If they're very different, you can. But a common challenge, of course, with healthcare data in particular, is that oftentimes we can't access all the data we'd like to train and test our model on, especially not all at the same time. We cannot always pool together in the same database data from different sources, such as different hospitals, because the data owners themselves are unable or unwilling to share individual patient data outside their institution. And there's a big risk if patient data sharing goes wrong. You can see there the total HIPAA, which is forgotten the acronym, but that's the body in the United States who ensure the security of patient data records. Penalties are going up every year, and just from a quick Google, the 10 biggest healthcare data breaches of 2019 so far. It's a big problem. No one wants to be on that list of healthcare data breaches, so data owners are naturally very cautious to share their data. So one thing that I've been working on a lot at IQVIA, so topic that's close to my heart, is this idea of federated analysis. And for those of you who, I don't know, is anyone familiar with federated analytics? Some. So federated analysis is a privacy-preserving analytical tool that brings your analysis to the data rather than bringing your data to the analysis. So what I mean by that is, in a traditional kind of pooled analysis, we would need to take patient data from lots of different hospital sites, say, bring it together in one database and perform our modeling on that one database. What we currently would typically do instead, if that's not possible, would be some type of meta-analysis situation where we would independently fit different models at every different site and combine the summary outputs from those models in a meta-analysis. But federated analysis is a way of kind of combining the strengths of the two of them and the weaknesses as well, I have to say, where the analysis itself is distributed out to each different data site. Model updates are made locally, and the updates are communicated back to the server, so patient data never leaves the hospital site. So this kind of method gives you analytical results that are equivalent to if you had pulled all your data together in a data warehouse. However, it fully preserves the data privacy, as the hospital knows that that data has never been shared outside of that hospital firewall. So it's a pretty cool technique. It definitely takes some investment to develop the federated network itself, not just in the technology, but also investing in the relationship with all of the data sites and proving to them that what you say, that the data is never being shared, really is true, that it's not being shared. But this is a very exciting way, I think, that we could get around this data sharing issue in the future.
Fantastic. So I'm going to wrap up with a few takeaways. So I guess the key message of anyone who is involved for a startup or a company or an academic institution working in trying to build machine learning algorithms for healthcare settings is that if you want to start deploying it in real-world settings, you will be asked to demonstrate, or increasingly will be asked to demonstrate this issue of transportability. And out-of-sample and external validation is really key for assessing how well your predictive algorithm generalizes to new settings. So that's really the take-home message. And then you know, this issue about kind of related but different is a fuzzy concept, but there's methods you can use, including building or training new models, like mentioned models, to help to try and assess that and quantify how easy it is to classify patients. And lastly, a point I haven't put on here, there's a whole lot of other techniques you can start to draw on to help to get through some of the challenges in using healthcare data, like doing this in a sort of a federated analytics framework. You can use simulated data to help to get over some of the issues of data access. I would say healthcare is a fantastic setting to work in, despite the fact it's difficult and difficult to get things kind of scaled up. Some of these challenges are really intellectually really interesting to try and overcome. So a little shout out for working in healthcare. We also organise a sister meetup. Do you want to talk about this? Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Just sneak in a little plug for our own meetup. Yeah. So join us at the London Clinical and Health Data Science Meetup is one I organise. We organise events roughly quarterly that relate to clinical research and health data science. The last one we had was on automation and visualization. And we've previously talked about ethics, bioinformatics, and synthetic data as well. So do join the group and wait for the next event. I haven't organised it yet.
Great.
Yeah, and this is our contact details should you want to get in touch. But are there any questions? Yeah.
So how do you deal with false positives and false negatives? Like, which one do you prioritize and why? And how do you take care of such scenarios, like it doesn't go bad for the patients?
It depends very much, I think, on the application of the algorithm that you're using. And you could think of an analog, for instance, in the kind of medical tests that already happen outside of the context of AI. So if you're getting a test to say, for instance, I was reading about this in the context of HIV tests, where you would rather get a false positive than a false negative, because if you got a false positive, you could have further tests and determine, oh, it was a false alarm. But if it's a false negative, then you're going about your life thinking you're fine, but you've really got HIV. So it really depends on the application of the algorithm as to what is riskier, and how the stakeholders balance those risks to say which they can live with. Go ahead.
How do you deal with, say you've got your two slightly different data sets which you're measuring with this, say, a membership model. How do you deal with the fact that one data set might be different in ways that are easy to tell the data set apart, but not in meaningful ways for the actual other analysis that you want to do?
Good question, and there's not an easy answer to it. I guess so you can have these methods basically to assess, to try and quantify how different the data sets are, either in a crude sense, a multidimensional way. It doesn't answer the questions like how important is that difference. I think in this particular setting, when we basically want to go out and try and find data that is related but different enough, so basically you want to do these tests and say, okay, the data's pretty different. To some extent, it doesn't matter like the meaning of the difference if the aim is then to evaluate your algorithm, demonstrate transportability, because if your algorithm does well, that's fine. You don't have to worry about it. It does become informative when your algorithm falls down and you want to work out why, and that does raise interesting questions, because then it's can be quite a useful sort of diagnostic tool of unpicking maybe some of the hidden mechanisms of your trained model by learning the way it fails. But it's quite challenging to work out what is the important features of difference between data sets.
Slide number 10. So, just out of curiosity, isn't this question? Sorry, 11.
Okay. So the question is, why would we consider that transport would be even a relevant question when these kind of settings are so different? San Francisco is very different from Beijing, culture, environment, healthcare system. Well, I guess the reason is that an example might be you might be a company that's developed an algorithm and you want to sell it around the world, and just want to buy other hospitals to start buying it and start deploying it in their setting. So that might be a sort of example. So
my question was also around transportability, around the same question. But okay, so let's say if you have again the same client who is present in the UK and the Chinese market, and let's say if you develop a model in the UK market and your accuracy for lung cancer prediction is 85%. Now if you use that same model for the Chinese, probably let's say your accuracy is 30%. You keep on training your model. Is it possible that your model can get better than 85% for both the countries, or is it possible that it may get better for Chinese but may drop down for the UK market, the same model?
yeah, so I don't know if you want to pick this up, Fiona, but I mean, often there are trade-offs between performing, optimized for a single data set or particular situation versus generalizability, which is slightly analogous to the sort of variance bias trade-off, but sometimes it can be a trade-off between this high internal validity to a particular setting versus generalizability. I don't think necessarily always, but in practical sense that often you might have to go for something that is like good enough in one setting but performs good enough in many settings, rather than something that's just perfectly honed from one setting but then falls down badly when faced with new data.
Have you looked at any AI models, and are there any FDA-guided principles about developing AI models?
So the question was, have we looked at AI models and are there FDA guidelines? So yes, we do. So that's one of the things we do. And the FDA currently has some guidelines out for consultation about their sort of regulatory approach for assessing AI algorithms that you can find on the FDA website. And I believe they'll be finalised sort of early next year. But they give a good detail about what's to come. Question back here. Okay, so two questions. First of all, how we deal with the challenge of, sort of missing data in longitudinal time series data, and secondly, are we using all neural networks or using simpler methods? So the first question is I would go and ask Fiona how we're going to deal with the challenge of missing data. So in the spirit of that, I'm going to ask her to tackle that question.
Yeah, so I would say, that is the multi-million-dollar question. And I think that's kind of the motivation as to why, if you remember back to the beginning, we would have a department at IQVIA for real-world evidence as opposed to, for instance, the healthcare equivalent would be a clinical trial where you can make sure that you see the patient at regular intervals and collect that data. But in the real world, of course, that doesn't happen. So so that doesn't answer your question, but it's very difficult in summary. I think it's sometimes the missingness, the reason for it is important. So you could think, is it just missing at random or is it informative? And sometimes, informative missingness, it could itself be useful to you. So maybe if a patient is missing a lot of appointments, that says something bad about their survival. Anyway, it's complicated is all I can sum it up. And I think we have a lot of different techniques that we might use depending on the specific scenario. So we could talk more about that later if you like. And I've forgotten what the second question was.
So the second question was, are we using neural networks or deep learning or sort of more traditional machine learning methods? So I think probably speaking of the whole people working in this data science area is there's obviously a lot of interest in deep learning, particularly in the setting of imaging, particularly medical imaging diagnostics, because it's very well suited to that sort of data. For other settings such as electronic healthcare records, I think probably the bias is probably more towards, simpler models such as various types of ensembles or type methods. For a couple of reasons, partly because of some of the issues in terms of the data structures is quite hard to untangle, and also for this issue of deployability. So there's quite a lot of sort of debate and discussion about the importance or not of explainability for some of these algorithms. And although there are methods for helping to demonstrate sort of explainability for neural networks, in all honesty, it's probably not as well developed as it is for other some more traditional methods, and that's probably a bit of a barrier for this this type of setting when we're using electronic healthcare records. So,
Thank you.